Hi guys, and welcome to another video. This is Julia Walker with Grey Duck Forge, and today we're going to be digging into a fairly niche topic, specifically looking at how bones are named and developing some tips and tricks to remember which bone is which. We're going to be looking more at the broad strokes, not going into any of the parts of the bones or anything like that, just a firm foundation of the basics. But it will cover the knee and the hock, so it'll be kind of technically dense and interesting. So with that, let's take off. For our examination of how the bones of the legs are named, we're going to be looking at a few important areas of the horse's limb. So we'll start with the easiest areas and work our way to the more complicated ones. So first the sesamoid bones, then talk about the phalanges, then the cannon bone and its friends, i.e. the metacarpals and metatarsals, then the carpus or the knee, and lastly the tarsus or the hock. So first we have the sesamoids. When we're talking about how they are differentiated, all the scientific names for them are referencing their directions. Therefore, we need to understand a couple of directional terms that get used a lot in bone naming. First, proximal and distal. We can think proximal meaning in close proximity to the horse's heart, and distal meaning distant from the heart. So that's proximal, and that's distal. I suppose finish that word there. And then there are medial and lateral. We can think of medial meaning towards the middle or center line of the horse, and lateral meaning towards the outside or away from the horse. And this is if there's another leg over there. So there you go. So in terms of the sesamoid bones in the limb, there are the ones up top and the one down below. So meaning the proximal sesamoids and the distal sesamoid. Then to differentiate between the proximal sesamoids, since there are two of them, there is the medial proximal sesamoid bone and the lateral proximal sesamoid bone. Pretty easy so far, so let's continue. Next up are the phalanges or phalanx bones, meaning the horse's finger bones from the fetlock down. We gave them numbers when we're naming them, from 1 to 3, and we generally count all bones in order, which in the limb means away from the center. So in this case, we start with the most proximal bones and count up as we move distally or away from center. So thus, P1 is closest to the heart, then P2 is the next closest, and lastly, P3 is the farthest from the heart. Super easy. That's all we need to know down here, so moving on. Now we're getting into the metacarpals / metatarsals, or the cannon bone and the splint bones, and they are all the same type of bone. That prefix meta means after or beyond. So the metatarsals are beyond or distal to the hock or tarsus, and the metacarpals are beyond or distal to the knee or carpus. So which metacarpal / tarsal is which? Well, they're numbered moving away from center. So on the right here, we have a drawing of a human hand. And our metacarpals are labeled 1 through 5 as we go away from the most medial, which is our thumb. You can tell that the thumb is the most medial because when you let your arms drop to your sides loosely, the thumb is going to fall to the inside. And as we love to say, horses stand on their middle fingers, so that means that after their proverbial wrist, they have one main metacarpal / tarsal that they're using. And from the diagram, we can see that our middle finger is the third metacarpal or tarsal. But the splint bones are the same type of bone as the cannon bone, and they are directly next to the cannon bone, so the medial one is going to be that, like the index finger, so that it'll be the second. And the lateral one is going to be our the ring finger, and that'll be the fourth. Cool. So just like the phalanges, we are increasing a number as we move away from the center, which for these is going to be from medial to lateral, whereas this is for the phalanx bones. Sweet. So in this diagram, which is which, I've got the medial and lateral sides labeled at the bottom. A is going to be your medial side, so that'll be your second metacarpal, or M2. B is your cannon bone, so we all know that that is M3. and C is on the lateral side, so that'll be M4. Wonderful. Easy. Cool. Now we're on to the next problem area. The normal rules still apply, but things are going to get a little complicated. So, we have in the carpus 7 to 8 short bones. That's a really important fact, which are those cube-shaped bones that are designed to bear lots of weight. But they're separated into 2 layers-ish, and things are a little extra because of it. So some rules that they follow are when the bones have numbers, they increase as we move laterally. If the bones are closer to a larger, fancy-named bone, they might have a name that references that bone to differentiate it from bones that aren't near a big fancy bone. The accessory carpal bone it's like a miscellaneous knee bone, but just remember it's on like the back and outside of the knee. And the bigger bones are on the top layer, and the small bones are on the bottom layer. We also have a bone that we couldn't come up with a meaningful name for, so since it's between 2 notable bones, they call it that intermediate carpal bone. So it's like they were trying to be intentionally confusing because there's a lot of like middles in the carpus, but it's fine. There's just the one that's named that. So let's jump into this. And that is a lot of bones, but here's an overview of what we're going to pick apart. This is a really helpful picture because not every diagram of this region shows basically every involved bone in a single picture. So maybe screenshot it and save it for your reference. And you can tell which side is medial and which side is lateral based on the splint bones in here. And that's your third metacarpal, your cannon bone there. So since M2 is on the left side, that's the medial side because we know they go medial to lateral. So to try and keep things sensical, I made sure that the medial is again on the left and the lateral is still on the right, but we're basically looking at the knee in 2 parts, and basically the top surfaces of the involved bones, the top, and this is sort of like forward on the horse, so towards the head. So that top layer is on the left and the bottom layer is on the right. Don't let your eyes swim. I know it's not like the normal way that we look at this, but it is kind of helpful to be like sheet 1, sheet 2, just 2 cross sections. Cool. So the top part of the carpus has mostly A, B, and C, making up like the majority of that joint surface. And those are larger. It's not totally to scale here, but they are the larger bones. So the radial carpal bone is the most medial, so that's A. And the ulnar carpal bone is going to be kind of the most lateral of that main bearing surface, and so that's C. And then that intermediate one, super annoying, but that is the one in the middle, and that's letter B. And then hanging off the back, not really doing a lot in the order of bearing weight, is that extra miscellaneous bone, the accessory carpal bone, letter D. Cool. So that's the top layer. Then on the bottom layer, now we're a little bit farther away from the body, so now we're getting into the numbered bones. The first one, E, is that first carpal bone. It's often fused to the next bone, F, which is, oh man, I'm just going to start writing these over here. That's C2, the second carpal bone. And then moving laterally as we go, we have G is C3, and then H is C4, and that's it. That is the knee. And when I was talking about the carpal bones being named after the big bone that's near them, that's a reference to the radial carpal bone being named after the radius, which is this bone, and the ulnar carpal bone being named after the ulna, or like the elbow bone, which is this one. And how we know which carpal bone is which actually has to do with the fact that the ulna, as it goes down, actually points like to the outside, the lateral side. So that lateral top carpal bone is going to be that ulnar carpal bone. And so then you've got the other one that's underneath the radius here on the inside, and then this is that intermediate. So that's why the ulnar carpal bone is on the outside part of the knee, though. It's just because the ulna points laterally as it goes down towards that outside. And then knowing that, everything else you can kind of reverse engineer once you know why everything is where it is. So that was a lot. But now we are ready to talk hock. So the tarsus has 6 to 7 bones, some of which are short bones and some of which are kind of weird shaped named bones. But some things to note, that calcaneus bone is the big bone that when you grab, the point of the hock is directly under your hand. I think of making my hand into the letter C when I reach for the calcaneus bone, if you're looking for a way to remember that name. The talus bone has the hinge-shaped condyles in it, and it interacts with that tibia to rotate the hind leg laterally or towards the outside. When that hock is flexed, when the leg is reaching forward, it comes out to the outside. That's because of the shape of the talus bone. And then, just like with the carpus, the fancier names are up top, and then the numbered names are on the bottom layer. And there is, in the hock, central tarsal bone, kind of like that intermediate tarsal or intermediate carpal bone, but it's just a bone that's in the middle of easier to name bones on either side of it. So here is my simplified version of the hock. Kind of got a medial side and a lateral side, because otherwise you can't get everything in there. But we've got the big ol' calcaneus bone, these big ones, and then the talus is going to be this hinge-shaped bone over here, and then those are just 2 main characters basically to just memorize. And yeah, I also think of the shape of the talus bone, it kind of reminds me of like the curved talons of like an eagle because of those big deep condyles. So that's how I remember its name, for what it's worth. So yeah, and then underneath it you can see there are a couple of kind of goofy layers. The middleist layers, the middleist of the layers has basically just one bone, and it's that central tarsal bone in here. And then on the inside of the bottom layer, we have this little blob that's sort of like T1 and T2, but they're pretty much always fused. And then moving laterally, we've got that third tarsal bone here. You can kind of see it on both sides. And then that big ol' fourth tarsal bone that is only on the lateral side. So this is the central. You got 1 and 2. These are both 3. This big one's 4. Cool. But you can see, just like with the knee, the hock has a formula for naming its bones, and it follows the usual patterns. That's super helpful because we as farriers don't have to memorize as much if we can remember the patterns. So, to wrap up this long, prattling description of how the bones of the horse's limb are named, let's summarize the trends. Count as you go away from the center. That could be distally, laterally, whatever, just count away from the middle. Some of the bones in the knee are named after their heroes, aka the big bones on top of them. We learned that the terms intermediate and central were basically just the best words people could come up with for a bone that otherwise has no obvious differentiating characteristics. And then we had a couple other bones that had special names because they're special bones, like the calcaneus, think of making your hand C-shaped to cup the point of the hock, the talus, think of an eagle's talons, and the accessory carpal bone, just an accessory, not bearing a bunch of weight, and hanging off the back/outside of the knee. And those are the patterns of the bones of the limb to follow. Now you know. Hopefully you learned at least one new thing. But thanks for joining me on this adventure. I enjoy reading up on these technically dense topics, but not every video I make will hit as complicated of a topic. I personally tend to dislike memorizing stuff and prefer to know what rules things follow, so even if I don't remember all the specifics, I can at least figure out which is which after thinking it through, so hopefully this helps with that. Next up, we're going to just be doing a quick review of all the bones of the limb, so stick around for that, front and hind. As always, if you have any feedback, corrections, concerns, rebuttals, or miscellaneous insults, feel free to drop them in the comments. Thank you, and as usual, stay tuned for more.